Good afternoon, everyone. Could you welcome James Robertson? It's a great pleasure to see a full tent, which was expected and has duly materialised, for James, who's such a wonderful writer, in whose work we're also interested. And an enormous pleasure to be able to introduce an event which I hope will have a little bit of life to it. Not that it wasn't going to have life to it, but you know what I mean. Because Jimmy Hutchison is here. Jimmy, where are you? Oh, you're there. Who's going to sing a couple of songs. Jimmy and I, funnily enough, James rang me up and said, we're going to have a couple of songs. There's a guy called Jimmy Hutchison. I said, Jimmy Hutchison. And little did he know that I was on the founding committee of the Keith Traditional Folk Festival in 1975, when he was a star performer, and he was telling me he was back there last year. Anyway, so I've known him for longer than we care to think about. So Jimmy's going to give us a couple of songs, and James is going to read a couple of extracts from the book to give you all a flavour, because today is the launch day of the book. It's not been around. Most of you will not have seen it. I've been through it. And it's a book that touches on things which I think we will all find extraordinarily interesting, moving, irritating, perceptive, thought-provoking. The title, incidentally, And the Land Lay Still, and I think this is worth saying, comes from one of Eddie Morgan's sonnets from Scotland, which James reproduces on the frontispiece of the book. Just give you a couple of sentences. The year was ending and the land lay still. Despite our countdown, we were loath to go, kept padding along the ridge, the broad glow of the city beneath us and the hill swirling with a little mist. That's the beginning of the sonnet. And I want to, before I ask James to read a passage from the book, just to ask a couple of questions about that. Because in some way, this book seems to me to be something which in some ways belies its title. Because you talk about stillness and settlement and calm, and the picture you present of 50s and 60s Scotland is one of a very, very strongly rooted community. But what the book is about, in the doings of all the characters and the various families who interact, is of turbulence and of uncertainty, and in the end, of a lack of resolution. Is that fair?
Yes, I think
Don't say no.
Well, the book is about change. I mean, I think the title tells you that there is, underneath all the human change, the struggles and the turbulence that you've described, there is a sort of a permanence, and that is resident in the land, if you like. But yeah, it's a big period that is covered by the book, and a lot of things happen between the 1950s and just a couple of years short of where we are now. So there is masses of human change, social change, cultural change, political change. But yes, there is a sense at the end of the book that things are not yet resolved. There is, although the book comes to an end, I would say there is no end to the story at that point.
Is that a feeling that you have in your own mind about things, as distinct from a feeling that the characters may have?
Yes, because I think that's the nature of history and the nature of time. You know, and it's one of the things that actually comes up again and again in the book, that every time you think that a particular story is ending, it isn't. It is either part of a bigger story, or there is a sort of diversion into another story. So there is never an end to anything.
And one of the themes of the book, I suppose, is how we look at past events. I mean, there's a lot of birth and some death in the book. Well, I mean, that happens if you're dealing with 50 or 60 years. But it is about the passage of time and how time, in a way, changes our view of events.
Yeah, and also how our view of time changes as well. I mean, most of the events that are talked about in the book happened in my lifetime. And yet even things that happened 20 years ago that I was part of, or that I witnessed as an adult, feel like ancient history. And I think that's really interesting, how rapidly the things that we thought belonged to us pass into something that is no longer with us, but past.
I have to say, I never thought I'd read a novel in which the Pollock by-election of 1967 would be resurrected. But I mean, there it is. Let me ask you just a technical question. You know, want to get technical about this as a writer, asking you as a writer, but it's interesting what you've threaded through the story, which is a passionate story of people who are trying to find their identity, who are doing all sorts of things, who are finding themselves, who are breaking up, coming together, all the things that human beings do. What you also do is you thread through the real story of what's happened in Scotland. You know, elections, for example. Now, it's quite tricky because you obviously feel that you have to tell people what happened in the 1974 election in February and then happened in October. And so you have to get the facts out there. How difficult was that? The so-called info dump.
It's a difficult balancing act, but that's why I said it's interesting how one begins to think of things as history. It is a historical novel, and yet it's a historical novel that's happened in most of our lifetimes. But it is quite difficult. I mean, I've written 2 or 3 books.
Did you struggle with that?
I think it's always a struggle to know how much factual detail you need to put in that isn't going to overbalance.
Especially when it's recent.
Particularly when it's recent, because people will dispute it. If you write, as I've written in the past with some of my other books about the 17th century, 18th century, nobody's going to argue with you too much about it.
Because they want to be reminded, yes.
But when you talk about the 1967 election or the poll tax, people kind of go, well, that's not how it was, you know, in Linlithgow or whatever. Yeah. So there's always that danger.
Why do you say Linlithgow? I know Alex Salmond is a black bitch, but I mean, I hope you get the detailed reference there. It's a very polite reference to somebody born in the boundaries of Linlithgow, as Tam Daly and Alex Salmond both were. What a pair. Anyway, never mind, carry on.
Well, there you are, though. I mean, Linlithgow, obviously was subconsciously there. It's Tam Daly, Alex Salmond, I mean, all of these characters who seem to have loomed so large in my kind of political understanding of what's been happening to Scotland over the last 30 or 40 years. They are sort of in the backdrop of the story. It's not that they have walk-on parts, but they're there, and they're there in the backdrop of all of our lives as well. I mean, one of the things that I think has happened to us as a community, a society, a nation, is that our identity has shifted dramatically because of the politics. It seems to me that at the period when the book starts, the 1950s, that Scotland was probably as British as it was ever likely to be. We'd just come out of the Second World War.
It seemed settled, unchanging.
There'd been that united front against fascism, etc., etc. And yet, within 20 or 25 years, suddenly you have this other identity forcing itself to the surface because Britishness no longer seemed to work for a large percentage of the population.
There's a wonderful passage which runs for 2 or 3 pages quite early on in the book, where you sum up or give a picture, give a feel of 1950s Scotland. It was the point at which I realised I'm slightly older than you, and you were doing this in recollection. I never thought, rather like a book that wouldn't mention the Pollock by-election, that there would never be a book with the McFlannels in it. Now, you see, there's a little flicker of recognition and remembrance about the McFlannels, and this was, if you like, Gordon Brown's 50s, wasn't it? This is the Scotland that created people who are vaguely in their 50s.
Absolutely.
And you're slightly younger than that. But you see that period, you know, of the Sunday Post years of the 50s, when, you know, 80% of the population read the Sunday Post. You know, Tom Nairn said famously afterwards, you know, Scotland will not be free until the last minister is strangled with the last copy of the Sunday Post. That's slightly unfair, but I mean,
he did actually
unfair on the Sunday Post and unfair on Church of Scotland.
Yes, well, he apologised more recently and said that he would.
He'd gone over the top slightly. He'd gone over the top. But anyway, that's a very convoluted question. But you, to say the least, but you present a picture of a Scotland that seemed unchanging, and then everything happened.
Oh, even when I was growing up.